The next thing we'll be looking at is reasons for the adoption of indirect rule. You will recall that indirect rule was not used in all parts of Nigeria. It was only used in some parts of Nigeria that we call the Crown Colony. And then in the protectorate part of Nigeria, that was where indirect rule was used. So if the British used direct rule in the Crown Colony of Nigeria, why then did they have to use indirect rule in the protectorate part of Nigeria? What changed? What was the obstacles they came across that made them feel, oh, we can't use indirect rule in the whole of Nigeria? What were the problems that came up in using direct rule that they felt, oh, direct rule would not work in every part of Nigeria? And why would they use direct rule in some parts of Nigeria and not use direct rule in the other parts of Nigeria? That is what we'll be looking at in this topic. Reasons, in this subtopic, reasons for the adoption of indirect rule in Nigeria. The first a major reason for the adoption of indirect rule in the protectorate part of Nigeria is lack of British personnel. Having used direct rule in some parts of Nigeria, British officials found out that Nigeria was like a burial. There were diseases in Nigeria that the whites could not handle, that would kill the white in an instant. So Nigeria was nicknamed the burial ground for the whites. So the British officials were not even happy to come here. You know, the weather was different from their weather, and also using lots of British officials would be expensive for the monarch, for the British, because they would have to spend more money to pay the officials, to pay the personnel. So there was lack of British personnel. There was inadequate fund. The monarch was not planning to spend so much money on Nigeria, was not planning to spend so much money on this protectorate parts of Nigeria at that time. So because of lack of fund, Lord Lugard decided to use the indirect rule system, since the indirect rule system he had used it in some places and it was okay. So since the monarch was not planning to spend so much money on Nigeria, on the protectorate part of Nigeria, they had to adopt indirect rule system. The next is the success of the system in India and Uganda. This system of indirect rule has been used by Lord Lugard in India. And then he found out that the system worked very well. Oh, the people in India, they respected their traditional rulers so much. And he found out that if there was any change in their political system, they would rebel against them. So he found out that, oh, yes, let's use the indirect rule system. It worked well in India, and we don't even have funds at the moment. So the best thing to use is indirect rule. So because the system of indirect rule has proved successful in India and Uganda, they decided to use indirect rule also in Nigeria. The next is to satisfy their economic need. As I said earlier, a protectorate is a territory that the colonial masters protect because they want to exploit it. So they had needs for the raw materials that were produced in Nigeria. So they decided to use indirect rule to satisfy their economic needs. You give us this, we protect you. So to satisfy their economic needs, they adopted indirect rule. The next is the role and position of the traditional rulers. They found out that the traditional rulers were very exalted people. For example, in the north, they saw their traditional ruler, the emir, as somebody that was sent to them from God. So the emir was a highly respected person. So imagine the British official deposing the emir of their duty and saying they want to be in charge. The people are going to rebel against them. So they found out that the role and the position of the traditional rulers was very exalted. The people highly respected their traditional rulers, and that any change in the system would be a problem for them. So they had to adopt indirect rule. The use of traditional rulers and their institutions. The political, when they found out that in Nigeria we already had a political institution in place, they decided to use it instead of changing the whole system and changing the whole system would also need a lot of funds. So instead of changing the whole system, they decided to ride on the fact that we already had traditional rulers and we already had political systems of administrations in place. The next thing is the large expanse of land. Nigeria is very, very large. The fact that Nigeria was large back in the 1920s and the 18th century has not changed even now. Nigeria is still very, very large. So if they were to send British officials to Nigeria, they would send a lot of them, and sending a lot of them would cost them a lot of money. So because Nigeria was very large and is still very large, they needed the indirect rule system of administration. Seemed like the best choice of the people, of the colonial masters then, since we already had political institutions in place. They decided to use those political institutions in place instead of starting to build their own, each building colonies and all that, and it would cost a lot of British officials, a lot of funds. They decided to use the systems of administrations already in place because of how large Nigeria was. The next thing is language barrier. Till date, it has not changed. The fact has not changed that Nigeria is a multi-ethnic country. We have different ethnic groups. We have different languages. We have about 257 languages in Nigeria, even more because there are some that are already even going into extinctions. There are very minor ethnic groups that are not being recognized. This is just like the recognized ethnic groups in Nigeria. And because we have so many ethnic groups, we have diverse languages, it is very, very difficult. It would be very, very difficult for British officials to communicate with the people, to communicate with the people directly, to pass their policies, to enforce their regulations on the people. It would be very difficult for them if they had to be involved with the people directly. But using traditional rulers, they only needed interpreters. So they have they already cut down the need for numerous interpreters, let's put it that way. Numerous interpreters, because if they were to be the governors themselves, if they were to be the ones enforcing these policies in the little communities and all that, they would need a lot of personnel. They would need lots of people that understand both the local languages and the English language for communication to be easy. So because we had diverse languages in Nigeria, the indirect rule was the best choice for the British colonial masters to use. Also, the fact that the political systems of administration that we already had in place was stable. It was a very, very stable system of administration. We had how we administered justice. We had our executive arms. We had our judiciary. We had our legislative arms. We had people that were performing these different functions. It was not like it was very stable. It was not unstable. It was not like it was something that had been used for a very long time. It was a system of administration that had been in place for a long time, and it was stable. So they decided to use our pre-colonial political systems of administration already in place because it was stable. Also, the lack of finance. There was not enough funds. And with this, we've come to the end of the class. In the next class, we'll be looking at the advantages of indirect rule, the disadvantages of indirect rule, and the success and failure of indirect rule in some parts of Nigeria.